So I find words interesting in a way that a lot of people don't. I think semantics are important in a way that a lot of people don't. Often when you'll get into an argument or discussion, someone will dismiss what you're saying as semantics, as though that was some kind of trump card in the argument. But if we don't agree on the meaning of words, then we can't communicate effectively wardrobe, hat stand, trout, orangutan, tangent. I mean, those words could mean something entirely different to me than they do to you, which is why you're so confused right now. But if nobody outside me knows what I meant when I used those terms, we can't meaningfully communicate, which demonstrates the necessity of having a common understanding of the meaning of language. And some people deliberately obfuscate the meaning of words or refuse to accept what you're saying about the meaning of the words, even when you explain it. This is a really common problem in political arguments and in religious arguments. There are people who refuse to accept what the actual meaning of the term socialism is, for example, confusing it with communism and confusing communism with totalitarianism. Managed in the end. When it comes to atheism, there are people who insist that atheism only means strong atheism, that is the active belief that there is no God. Whereas atheism tends to mean, in the modern context, most broadly and most encompassingly, I don't believe in God, and that's it. So it's just the disbelief. Now, I'd always assumed that the term atheism had gone through some changes and stages, and that it used to mean that kind of strong atheism. But that's not actually the case, as I found out. I'd assumed that it had come to this new meaning of simple lack of belief quite recently, and it turns out that that's not the case. I probably should have investigated a bit more beforehand. There was no harm in assuming, but genuine knowledge is better. And it's been interesting to compare the way that the term atheism has changed meaning with the way that the term paganism has changed meaning, because the original meanings of both words are remarkably similar, but the end product of what they mean now is remarkably different. I find that interesting. Now, it may surprise some of you, since you know how insistent I am on the meanings of certain terms like racism and sexism and so on, that I would be willing to accept and understand the change in the meaning of terms like atheism and paganism. But the difference here is that the meanings of words like atheism has changed organically and consensually and emergently and anarchically over time throughout society, whereas the attempts to change the meaning of racism, sexism and so on, these are attempts to top-down change the meaning of terms in society. It's an attempt to dictate a change in language, and that's why I reject that. It's Orwellian newspeak. It's not a natural shift in the meaning of terms over time. It's an imposition, it's hierarchical, it's authoritarian. That's why I reject it. Well, one of many reasons I reject it. But okay then, what about atheism? And what about paganism? So if you break down the meaning of atheism, the prefix is a, which means without, and theism means belief in God. At least that is the modern meaning. So to be a theist is to be without belief in God, just by the strict meaning of the word. Its origin is in the Greek, meaning a, without, and theos, without God. In that instance, it meant anyone who didn't believe in the Greco-Roman pantheon. That's what it meant. Anyone who didn't believe in that also had connotations meaning, someone who was cursed or disfavored by the gods. That said, of course, there were Greek philosophers who did not believe in the gods, who didn't appear to explicitly refer to themselves as atheists, but nonetheless, the meaning of the term is there already in the direct etymological meaning of the word and historically. To not believe in the dominant religion of the time, that was the case. Then we have a pretty large gap. The term turns up again in the 15th century, I believe, or at least the 1500s, but then doesn't really come into common usage until the kind of rise of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the kind of anti-clerical stances there, and the rise of rationalism and so on. That's when you really start to get people talking about themselves as atheists. That's when that really starts to take off, when you have rationalists, freethinkers, and skeptics around. That's probably where we also get this response, this attempt to define atheism as this, not just a disbelief in God, but an active belief that there is no God. We probably find that rooted in the kind of theological and philosophical response to the skeptics and rationalists, and this is probably where this kind of cherry-picked set of definitions comes from. Now, I had assumed that was the dominant kind of paradigm of the time, philosophically, religiously, and so on, to characterize atheism as being this active belief that there is no God. But I got curious the other day and went looking around older dictionaries, and I found, just like today, there is a mix of different definitions which appear to betray the bias of whoever it was that was putting together the dictionary. But there are plenty of examples, just as there are today, of people getting the definition more or less right as we use it in the modern sense. To take one example, there's the Webster's 1828 dictionary, which you can find online, which characterizes atheism as disbelief in God, amongst other definitions. So that shows, confounding what I had thought, that our modern definition to be without belief in God goes, back even into the 19th century, when I had considered that the idea of it only being strong atheism had been dominant, had been paramount. Turns out not the case. Our modern current usage goes back as far as that, and further anyway, so I was wrong, and that just strengthens the case for atheists who insist that all it means is to be absent belief in God. The support, the common usage goes back way further than we thought. Now, theists who want to argue the toss on this will often refer to various philosophy texts, Stanford quite often, or will cherry pick other dictionary definitions, because there are dictionaries that get it wrong. In essence, they say it's belief that there is no God, but there are plenty of others that get it right, that it's the absence of belief. This is also true for philosophy texts. There is a difference apparently depending on the stance of the author. The Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, for example, understands and accepts that it is absence of belief and belief that there is no God, which is strong atheism or Gnostic atheism. What's amusing to me is that people who will happily refer to Antony Flew for his supposed conversion to theism, which is more complicated than it appears, they will happily refer to him about that, but it's him who really kind of codified and made explicit the differences between strong and weak atheism, between explicit and implicit atheism. So, if you're going to accept his supposed conversion to weak deism as some kind of victory, you should probably understand and accept his definitions of atheism as well. The other thing you'll find is that atheism is quite often defined as the denial of the existence of God. That has connotations to it which I don't personally like very much. I mean, to deny something implies that there is a case to be made for something, and I do not think that any evidence for a God exists. So technically I don't think there's anything to deny. But even so, if you kind of remove the emotive connotation in denial, it fairly well describes the atheist position. You're making a claim, we're denying that claim, we're saying I don't believe you. Do you deny the accusation that you murdered Mr. X? Yes, I deny the accusation that I murdered Mr. X. When you deny something, it has that connotation of guilt, as though your murdering of Mr. X was somehow not in question in some way. But realistically and practically, we often see denials when people are innocent. So to carry the analogy back over, deny God because there's no case for God. It's as simple as that. I just don't like the connotations and emotive implications in the term denial, so I do not believe fits better, I think. But many of these philosophical definitions also include the term denial, which again betrays the stance of the author, but fine, accept that. It essentially means the same thing. Okay, so how does this relate to the term paganism? Now, if I use the term pagan today, what do you think of? Maybe you think of, modern Norse religionists, or maybe you think of, Wiccans dancing skyclad in the woods or whatever. So when I say pagan, you kind of tend to think of these pre-Christian folkloric traditions, right? That's what tends to spring to people's minds. But what pagan used to mean was simply not Christian. So an atheist would be a pagan in the way it used to be used. Anyone who was not enrolled in the army of Christ in the terms of the church was considered to be pagan. That's what it meant. The root of it is in sort of rustic villages. In the kind of folkloric traditions, so in the folk religions, and the Christian religion very much inveigled itself into these beliefs. I mean, if you live in the UK like I do, you go from one village to another throughout spring, summer, autumn, you'll find all kinds of old pagan folkloric traditions dressed up in Christianity. You'll find well blessings, which are sort of takeovers from old folk traditions. You'll find maiden garlands and obioses and all kinds of stuff. This is old folk traditions which kind of survived in various forms and then got co-opted by the church. But those are what you might think that they're referring to when they say pagan, in terms of rustic, in terms of villager, in terms of commoner, which is its original meaning, and then you carry that through and you can see how it meant non-Christian, these folkloric traditions and so on. But pagan has come to mean what we think of it now, this kind of continuation of these folkloric traditions, even though they really only date back to, some of them to the Victorians, who kind of reinvented a bunch of this stuff, and some of it even to the 20th century Wiccans. Modern paganism has little or no relation to any genuine folkloric tradition, any pre-Christian religion, because we have no real way of knowing that much what these were like. But it's interesting to note that both atheism and paganism have a similar root meaning, as in, not believers in the dominant religious paradigm. But then pagan has come to mean a kind of category or type of religion, and atheism has come to mean no religion at all. And yet they both have that same initial starting point, by and large. It's just an interesting and fascinating exercise in how language develops organically. Not that any of this particularly matters. What matters is usage, and atheism has come to mean I don't believe in God, and paganism has come to mean I follow what I think of as being these folkloric traditions. And usage, ultimately, is what matters. So if you're going to argue atheism, you need to argue atheism as atheists use it. If you're going to argue paganism, you need to argue paganism as pagans use it. Zang.